This distribution has been gaining a lot of popularity in the world of Linux lately. It's called CachyOS, and the goal of this distro is to provide users with a Linux OS that is optimized for speed. So this isn't just another Debian or Ubuntu clone with a custom UI, but this also is not necessarily the first distro of its kind. CachyOS is basically borrowing the playbook from Clear Linux. So if you haven't heard of Clear Linux, this was a distro that was developed and maintained by Intel to run as fast as possible on their CPUs. And you can see here on the home page that it was actively developed from February 6, 2015 to July 18th of 2025. So Clear Linux is unfortunately not maintained anymore, but luckily we have the sauce. We know what makes these distros so fast. All the kernel configurations, all of the compiler flags, instruction sets can be applied to pretty much any Linux distribution. But CachyOS provides these optimizations pre-built into the distro, just like Clear Linux does, so you don't have to go through the work of compiling it yourself. CachyOS is also based on Arch Linux, so you get the benefits of the AUR for package management and the Arch Wiki for documentation, and they provide a handheld edition of CachyOS that has official support for handhelds like the Steam Deck, the ROG Ally, and the Legion Go. So they're clearly targeting the mobile Linux gaming market as well as the desktop Linux one. Now, a few months ago, Phoronix published benchmarks that they ran on an HP ZBook Ultra laptop running a few different distros, including CachyOS, Arch Linux, Clear Linux, Ubuntu, Debian, and Fedora. CachyOS and Clear Linux, the only two in this group with those out-of-the-box speed optimizations, perform the best on most of these tests pretty consistently. And mind you, they aren't just testing the raw speed of these distros, but they're also testing the performance per watt, which is a really big consideration on laptops and handhelds since it can translate to your work or gaming sessions, lasting a few minutes longer before you have to run to grab a charger. But I think it's a good idea to really look at these benchmarks before you rush and go and format your hard drive and install CachyOS, because if we take a look at the browser test, for example, there's only about a 1% difference between Arch and CachyOS, and sometimes Arch is actually faster. Same thing on the graphics test. CachyOS did perform significantly better in the FPS test for the game Unvanquished, although the margins between Arch and Cachy do shrink quite a bit when you put the game on ultra graphic settings. And again, with the Xenotic, we see a very marginal difference. Now, the Python and PHP scripting section of the benchmarks, they tell a different story. Clear Linux and Debian actually end up being the MVPs here, which goes to show you that these optimizations are not universal for all programs. And I actually learned this the hard way years ago when I was optimizing a Gentoo installation on one of my computers. You kind of naturally fall into messing with compiler optimizations when you run a source-based distro like Gentoo, and really that's the main reason to consider going through the trouble of installing one of those, in my opinion. But you still tend to end up getting about the same results as these benchmarks, where some programs are a little bit faster when you apply link time optimization or different instruction scheduling or register allocation, but then other programs, they actually end up getting slower depending on what kind of hardware you run. And so where you really get the most optimizations is when the system is tailor-made to the hardware and the software that you're actually going to be using. For example, a trade-off that you get with unrolling loops is a larger binary, because what basically happens is that the program, like if you have a loop that prints a number 10 times and it increments it 10 times, then that's going to get turned into 10 print statements in 10 increments instead of the loop. But loop unrolling can become counterproductive at a certain point if the programs that you're running end up having a whole lot of loops in them, which translates to a much larger binary size when you use that compiler flag, and an increased likelihood of cache misses happening when you run that program. And that depends again on how large the cache on your CPU is, but inevitably you're going to see a drop in performance that's worse than if you just left the loops in if a cache miss ends up happening. So if you're willing to really go into the details of how to optimize the software that you're using for the hardware that you're also using, then you can go pretty far with optimizing Linux. And if you're using mainstream software on officially supported CachyOS hardware like the Steam Deck, then I think there's a really good chance that you might end up getting the most performance optimized Linux experience right out of the box with that kind of setup. And another nice gaming focused feature of CachyOS is this gaming meta package that they've put together, which includes Steam, Wine, the Proton optimizations for Steam, drivers, and other libraries that you'd have to, well, first find out about if you're really new, if you're really green to gaming on Linux, and then manually install these on most other Linux distros, which of course you can do. But this is a really good addition here, I think, to help noobs get started with gaming on Linux, which is the hang-up that a lot of people still say they have with switching to Linux over Windows. And they also have an entire configuration article for gaming on CachyOS, so if you run into any problems, you'll more than likely find the answers here or on the CachyOS forums. And again, since this is an Arch-based distro, there's a good chance that there's going to be a lot of overlap between answers that you'll find in the Arch Wiki or Arch forums for your problems. Although I do need to point out that CachyOS is definitely not Arch Linux, so don't go to the official Arch forums posting issues that you have about CachyOS unless you want to get chewed out by nerds on the internet. Now you might be wondering why mainstream binary distros, Ubuntu, Fedora, all of those, don't just bother applying these same compiler settings to all of their packages and their kernel, and the main reason is that these optimizations can actually break compatibility for older hardware. If you're running something older than a Sandy Bridge Intel processor, for example, Clear Linux or CachyOS probably isn't going to be able to boot at all. So the mainstream distros choose to support the lowest common denominator instead of just kicking them to the curb for a 5% or so performance gain on average in programs that are being run on newer hardware with these compiler settings. It's sort of analogous to the differences in the parts that make up a race car or a sports car versus a more common commuter car. You know, obviously the race car is going to be a whole lot faster, but it's going to be missing a lot of luxuries, right? I don't even think they have air conditioning because the weight of the radiator and all that stuff would slow it down so much. You're going to have more space in your commuter car to carry things comfortably, right? Your groceries, your luggage, any of the things you might want to carry with you, even though you're technically going to be a little bit slower. So overall, I would say that this distro is great for gamers and people who like Arch-based distros especially, but maybe you want to go beyond Arch for some kind of reason. I mean, the increased performance and productivity of a well-tuned Arch system is one of the main things that I think make it so attractive to people, that and being able to brag that you use Arch Linux. But maybe, you know, once you've used Arch and you've gotten really comfortable with it, maybe you start flirting with the idea of installing Gentoo or another source-based Linux distribution that you can really optimize further. Well, CachyOS might actually save you from kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and switching to an entirely different distro with an entirely different package manager. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned this, but compiling packages with these optimizations, you know, most of the optimizations that are in the O3 collection, actually ends up taking a lot longer than compiling with O2. So you're going to be waiting a lot longer on a Gentoo system or some other source-based Linux distribution to compile and actually get to use your system. And since CachyOS is open source, their endless chase to be the fastest Linux distro available is going to pick up where Clear Linux left off, and helping other distro developers and Linux hobbyists figure out how to make their systems as fast as possible. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share it to hack the algorithm, and check out my online store, based.win, where you can buy my awesome merch like this Libre t-shirt or accessories for your phone or laptop. 10% store-wide discount when you pay with Monero XMR at checkout. Have a great rest of your day.